In today's modern world, insurance isn't always enough to protect your investment. So today we're discussing asset protection for real estate. I'm Kathy Fettke and welcome to the Real Wealth Show.
You're listening to The Real Wealth Show with Kathy Fettke, the real estate investor's resource.
Today we're bringing on Clint Coons, who's an expert in asset protection. We'll discuss why having an LLC is vital for real estate investors and how things like trusts can be beneficial. If you like this episode, we're hosting Clint on a webinar at Real Wealth, so make sure to visit realwealth.com to register. Clint Coons, welcome back to the Real Wealth Show.
Hey, Kathy, thanks for having me.
We're going to go back to basics. I know this might be old news for some of our more sophisticated investors, but there's still so much confusion about LLCs, when to get them, when is the right time to start. So when should somebody get an LLC when they start their investment journey?
So if you don't have real estate already and you're going to go out and you buy your first property, this comes up all the time. Do I need to get that LLC set up before I buy the property? And it's really driven by the type of loan you're going to obtain. If you're going to obtain a DSCR loan, which I assume everyone here is familiar with that, in that type of loan, you can close in an LLC. So I would advise people, if that's the loan you're going for, then set up a limited liability company and close directly in the entity itself. But if you're using conventional financing and you're qualifying, it's residential real estate, you can't close in the LLC. So to set one up in advance isn't going to benefit you. And I often tell people, just wait, close on the property. And then after you've acquired the property and it's in your name, then we can look at how best to move that property into the LLC. So it's state case specific. I mean, if you're doing certain other strategies, if you're flipping property, if you're wholesaling property, well, then maybe you do need an LLC set up before you do a deal. But for residential real estate investors who are holding property long term, I think it's a wait and see approach.
For those who don't know what a DSCR loan is, it's a debt service coverage ratio loan. So a first-time investor is probably not getting that, or maybe, but usually a newer investor would be getting a conventional loan. At Real Wealth, we have a bunch of lenders that we can refer you to that specialize in doing loans for investors. Once you max out, then you go to the DSCR loan. So I just wanted to be clear about that. Usually the earlier investor is going to be the one who maybe realizes, I can't get a loan. I'm not going to get financed in an LLC because a regular bank would see that as a business, as opposed to you as a person. Did I describe that right?
You did. And see, most of those loans that people are getting, conventional loans, they're underwritten by Freddie or Fannie guidelines is how they're writing these loans. And so the intention is that they want to sell those to Freddie or Fannie. And so with their guidelines, they will not buy a residential loan that's held inside of an entity. Now, they do permit you if they actually hold the note. So if you say you're working with Equity Mortgage and Equity Mortgage underwrites your loan, you obtain your property, they turn around 6 months later and they sell it to Freddie. Now Freddie owns that loan. And after Freddie owns the loan, you can move the property into the LLC without concern for the due on sale clause that we're going to be talking about here. I know that's a concern for a lot of people. But the fact of the matter is that at the outset, you have to close in your own name so they will purchase that. But if you're working with a community lender, which I tell all the investors that I work with, that are my clients, always have a relationship set up with a community bank. Because what I've found in my own investing is that sometimes I've worked with a traditional lender, a conventional lender, and they walk out on the 11th hour and they decide, we're not going to underwrite this deal because something's off with your debt to income ratio. You have a business that passes through and we don't like what we saw in your business. And that community lender will step in and they'll actually many times allow you to close directly in an LLC because that's a portfolio loan, which means they're going to keep that loan with the bank. They don't intend to sell it. So they're a little more lenient on how you close.
Yeah, get to know your community banks for sure. And that's one of the biggest mistakes people make is they just go to their regular bank, B of A or something, and
Hmm.
try to get an investor loan. That's going to be really hard. So I think one thing people don't understand is that, again, coming back to you find a property, you want to finance it. People always will say, do I do the contract in my LLC, or do I have my name on the contract? And who's actually buying this property? And there's confusion that an LLC is different than you. So just explain that difference between, like, I'm buying this property or this LLC is buying this property.
Yeah. So when you're making offers, if you're using private financing or you're going to use cash to acquire the property, then I always recommend you make an offer in the name of an entity. Don't even put your name on the offer. And the way you write that offer up, in the way I do it, is I'll put the name of my LLC and then I'll put and or designated entity. So I'm letting the seller know right away, hey, I may not close in the entity name. So if I put on there, Kingdom LLC and or designated entity, I'm not going to close in Kingdom. Potentially, I'm going to close in another LLC. I just don't know which one that is yet. And if you ever get pushback from a realtor or from the seller about that additional language, the way you address that is you tell them, well, my CPA or my attorney has told me that for estate planning reasons, they're not sure yet on how best to take title. And that typically nullifies those questions at that point in time. So in those situations, I like closing in an LLC. In fact, the way I set up my structure for a lot of our clients is we set up the structure in a way in which the LLC doesn't even show their information. So it's set up with privacy so that, the future tenants of that property do not know who the actual landlord is. Or if there's a creditor out there that's just sniffing around, they don't know what you're worth because they can't track you to the asset or the asset back to you. So that's how I would handle those situations. But if we're going back to that conventional financing route, then make the offer in your own name. That's going to be the simplest approach because that's what's going to be expected when you're working with your lender and when you're working with title. And obviously you have no asset protection there. And that's the greatest concern we have, because I'll give you an example of this. Recently I dealt with a client and they were attempting to close on a piece of property. They ended up walking away from the deal. And the seller is now coming after them, suing them for failing to close on the property. And their name
Hmm.
is on the contract. And this is what blows people away. They say, that's not right. You just lose your earnest money. Well, the fact of the matter is that in most states, your earnest money is not the only damage for a seller if you as a buyer fail to close on the property. Now, yes, they've passed all their contingencies, their inspecting contingency and their financing contingency, all that had been waived and they were past that period. And so they walked away from this contract because they discovered something. They're thinking, hey, I'm only going to lose my earnest money. But the fact of the matter is the seller can still sue you for damages. So that's why, in some instances, depending on the type of investments you're making, it's good to close or good to write your offer in the name of an entity, because if you found yourself in a position where the seller is trying to seek damages, they're seeking damages against the entity. If the entity doesn't have a lot of assets, or in my case, it's just an offering entity with a small bank account, they're not going to claim anything.
Brilliant. Okay, so the first step when looking at buying a property is knowing your financing, because once you've got that clear, am I using conventional? Am I using DSCR loan? Am I using cash? That will determine how you make the offer and which entity you would put it in your own name or in the name of what did you call it? I don't want to say it's a fake LLC, but it's an LLC that doesn't have a lot of assets in it.
Yeah, it's just my offer entity is the way I
Your
refer to
offer
it.
entity.
Yeah.
Okay. So why have an LLC? Let's come back to this because, again, for new investors, why an LLC and what does it do for you?
Hey, you see, a lot of attorneys will say, just load up on insurance. Why protect the asset with an entity? It's just going to complicate your life. And I tell people this, that I've been investing for 18 years and I have a decent sized portfolio. I've had 2 properties burned to the ground in the last 3 years, and I had a tree fall through the master bedroom during a windstorm and literally the branches landed on the bed of the tenant, and she was able to walk away. She wasn't injured.
Oh my gosh, that could have been
I
so much
know.
worse. Wow.
Could have been. Thankfully, I wasn't sued.
Mm.
But if I had been sued for any one of those three occurrences, if somebody had died, then what is the potential recovery there for someone, or what would the attorneys do if they said, all right, Clint has all these assets in his own name? They're going to blow past policy limits and they're going to seek as much as they can. They're going to look for profit taking there. So by using an LLC, the way I look at it is that it prevents the potential, if something did happen, from going beyond just your policy limits and the equity in the property. It just caps it right there. So you know my total risk of loss and the worst case scenario is X. And so I impress upon people that, most of my clients, have not been sued before, but for those that have gone through lawsuits, I've seen what type of damages the other side is seeking. And that by having entities in place, it just stops that dead in the tracks. And my clients have walked away from lawsuits literally with just having to come out, with not even coming out of pocket, the other side accepting the policy limits, because the nature of the structuring sent them a signal that even if you win, you lose. Because at the end of the day, you better take what you can get now. Otherwise, we're going to spend this policy down in defense and you may get nothing because there won't be any money left other than whatever's equities in the property. And so it's a great, I think, deterrence as well uh, when it comes to lawsuits. So I encourage people to set them up. I've never met someone that said to me, Clint, I regret the day I set up that LLC that protected my assets in a lawsuit. But I've talked to plenty of people who will come to us. Like I just met someone at a convention this past week that came to me and said, hey, I have this problem. And they had zero protection. And my hands are tied. I couldn't help them. And they're pleading with me. Yeah.
Your planning has to happen before the problems occur, not after.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's almost like an insurance policy. And I want to say at Real Wealth, we have over 80,000 members, and I don't want to scare people. Like, we don't see lawsuits. We don't, a lot of tenants just aren't going to bother to do that. And we haven't seen those kind of issues. And we personally haven't either, but we have LLCs because I don't want to be in the situation where I come to you and say, what do I do? And you say, you can do nothing. So, what are some other examples of how an LLC can protect you in the case that somebody does come after you?
Well, what it's going to do is it protects you two ways. Number one, it protects you from what happens inside of the LLC itself. So if that LLC owns a piece of property and there's a lawsuit, and in probably 30% of the time, the lawsuit that's brought isn't even covered under a policy because people aren't even aware that their policy excludes many of the types of cases that are being brought, discrimination claims, tenant harassment claims, toxic mold, environmental contamination. In fact, we had two situations recently where our client had sent a plumber out to a property, and his tenant is now alleging that the plumber that went out there to fix an issue with her toilet sexually assaulted her. And the
Oh
plumber said,
boy.
I never did that. Yeah, they're just getting sued for that. And I had another situation about 6 months ago where a guy was rehabbing a property. Delivery guys show up with the refrigerator, the countertop installer's there. They get in a fight, and the two delivery guys throw the refrigerator on him and fracture his leg in multiple places.
Oh my
And he's
goodness.
being sued for that. Yeah. So these are things that you just sit back and go, oh, I guess my insurance isn't really doesn't really protect me that much. But that LLC does, because now you know that what happens in those stories that I just shared with you, that's not going to impact you personally. You're not going to be named personally in that lawsuit unless they can or show somehow you were negligent. So that's the benefit of having it from what's inside of the LLC. But there's also the other side where if you yourself are involved in a lawsuit, somebody is suing you, you've now taken those assets that you own, bank accounts, real estate, and you've put them beyond the reach of your creditor. And a great example of that is one of our clients. He had opened up a nonprofit to help veterans. And his nonprofit engaged in what is referred to as equine therapy. So we'd bring veterans out to his property in Montana and
Yeah.
he'd have them ride horses and take care of the horses. And it helped them get past their PTSD. Well, he had this patron, this woman whose husband had fought in World War II, and he suffered from that. And she recognized the impact it has, not only on the individual's life, but the life of their family as well, having to deal with that. So when she found
Mhm.
out about this, she started giving him money to help support this cause because it was near and dear to her, and she had no children. So who else was she going to
Mm.
leave it to? She's a very rich widow. Well, she died, and her nieces and nephews hired an attorney, went through her account, saw that she'd made these large donations to this individual, and they then asserted that he had exerted undue influence over her, and
Mm.
they froze all of his accounts. They
Oh
walked
my
in,
goodness.
I know. And so he called us up and said, "What do I do? I can't access any of my funds. I'm going to lose my ranch here. I can't pay for anything any longer. I can't feed my horses." And so that's an example of where, had those assets been inside of an LLC, that attorney and those individuals would not have been able to freeze his funds because the case was directed against him individually. And so we want to take our assets and get them out of our name to prevent those types of claims freezing our ability to defend ourselves, freezing our ability to live in case of a lawsuit of that nature.
And you have to keep these LLCs alive in order to have that kind of protection. So, what do investors need to know about maintaining their LLC so that it does actually do what it's supposed to do?
Well, that's a great thing about a limited liability company. It's really easy to maintain. You do
Mhm.
not have annual meeting requirements like you would associate with a corporation. Um, the most important thing about having an LLC is that you renew it with the Secretary of State on an annual
Mhm.
basis. If you're doing that, you're really good. But the thing about setting these things up, though, I mean, some people fail at that. I had a client that had set up some LLCs before he met us, and he was flipping a property, and when he was doing it on his own, he dissolved the wrong LLC,
Oh
and it just
no.
happened. Yeah, yeah. The title picked it up, and they said, "We got a cloud on title. That company's been dissolved. You can't sell this." And he's, 5 days away from closing. So managing this stuff, is important because people get so wrapped up in their business they forget about the details.
Yeah, they forget about
Uh,
the wall that they put up that is
that's
needs to be
exactly
maintained.
right.
Yeah, so like part of it is you have to have like you have to have a special bank account for that LLC, and all transactions need to go through that special bank account versus outside of it. Would that be true?
That's that's somewhat accurate. It depends on how your structure is set up. So a lot of times, for individuals setting up a bank account in their limited liability company and just running all the income from that tenant through there works great. And I would recommend that, especially if you're new to investing and you're not used to tracking the funds, you don't have great bookkeeping or you're not using a bookkeeper. But then you look at like a lot of your students that you work with, the 80,000 you talked about, they typically invest out of state. And so when you're
Yeah.
investing out of state, you have a property manager and they're handling your properties and dealing with your tenants. And so in my experience and a lot of our clients as well, when you have say 4 properties in Oklahoma and they're in 4 separate LLCs, well, the PM that's managing those properties is going to send you a monthly owner statement and typically one wire. They do not want to send 4 separate wires for
That makes
$1,200.
sense.
They're going to, yeah.
Mm.
So then people say, well, how do I get it to go into my account? Well, in that case, you have a holding company and you just have all these LLCs are owned by this one holding company and it just goes down to that one account. So this is really what it comes back to, when we talk to individuals, investors, it's not a one size fits all approach. Knowing where
Mhm.
you invest, how you invest, what you're investing into, what your income level is, what you want to do in the future with your investing, all that needs to be factored in into the design of the plan.
So if you had that holding company and all the money went there, then would it just be an accounting issue from that, or you still need separate bank accounts where that holding company sends money?
It's a great question
Depends.
because
So like I can hear you.
so uh, I receive my owner statements and my wires every month. And I'll tell you what, it comes into the holding company and people say, well, then you need to move it back to the LLC. So let's say I have 15 LLCs held by one holding company. So then I need to turn around, move the money up to that LLC that owns the property, and then turn around and distribute it right back to my holding company because
Right.
I'm going to take it out of there. Yeah, and I've had people say that before, and I said, but that's
Yeah,
just
that's
stupid,
advice I've been given. So that's why I asked.
crazy,
Yeah.
crazy.
It is crazy and it's hard.
Yeah, get a bookkeeper and separately account for all of the income per the LLCs, and it's sufficient because a lot of people like to play the fear card about piercing the corporate veil, and if you don't follow all these formalities, you're going to lose the protection of the LLC. And and I tell individuals, hey, piercing a corporate veil typically requires at least a badge of fraud. You have to show that you committed harm to somebody, that there's something fraudulent involved. You know, the paying for a dinner out of your LLC that was personal, that's not going to pierce your company. Things like that.
Amazing. And this is one of the reasons I love you. You simplify everything. The other reason is that you bake bread. And who knew? Who would have guessed that?
Yeah.
And you are so good at this asset protection. All right. So trusts.
Mhm.
Uh, it's amazing to me that still so many people don't have them, especially if they own real estate. Why do you need a trust? And does it work for asset protection as well?
So it depends on the type of trust that you're thinking of. There's two types of trust we predominantly work with our clients. One is an estate planning, which is referred to as a living trust, and that's designed to handle all your assets when you've passed away to ensure that you avoid probate and to maintain some control over those assets. And I'll circle back to that. The other type of trust that we use is referred to as a land trust. And this is a very specific vehicle that's used purely to hold title to property. And people wonder, well, why do I need that land trust? Clint, you just said you can transfer real estate directly into an LLC. What would I use a trust for? Well, the problem we have with investors who have acquired property, let's say pre 2021, is that they bought these investment properties at a very low interest rate. And so if you transfer that property into an LLC and the mortgage is not held by Freddie or Fannie, like we talked about earlier, then your lender could possibly accelerate your note, which means they could call it due. It's referred to as a due on sale clause. How, if you were to Google this term. So what I don't want them to do is accelerate my note on my property and force me into refinancing at a higher interest rate. So then we're up against this wall. How do I move the property from my name to get the asset protection of an LLC without the risk of a lender accelerating? That's where we use a trust, a land trust. So by moving it into the land trust, you minimize that risk. Because if you're ever asked, why did you put the property into the trust? Your response should be, it's a grantor trust. And one of the benefits of it is estate planning to avoid probate, which is 100% accurate. But the reality is that the nature of a trust is that it can be assigned, transferred. So when we set up this trust, we set it up with you as the original owner. We move your property in, then we take the trust and we put it inside of an LLC for asset protection. Because if we just stop right there with the trust, yeah, it's out of your name, it's in the trust name, but it doesn't provide asset protection for you. So trusts are a very valuable tool to move property from your name into an LLC where we have that interest rate disparity. But they're also an important tool depending on where you're investing. So you take Florida, Tennessee, two of the main states where we always use trusts because of the fact that in Florida you have transfer tax issues. Tennessee, you have franchise tax issues. California is another state that has a franchise tax that people want to avoid. So when we're dealing with situations like that, then you want to look at trust over the LLC as that initial first step. So it just depends again.
So what I'm hearing is don't try to do your asset protection on your own.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that do it.
Forums on the internet and think you could do this.
Yeah. I know that we try to make it seem simple, but it's really in the details.
Yeah, it really
And
is.
yeah, I'll give you an example. So I met this individual one time. He signed up with us. He lives in Florida. And I was looking at his tax return. We have CPAs and attorneys. And so we look at everything. And I saw on his tax return that he was paying the state of Tennessee over $30,000 a year in franchise taxes, and he's a real estate investor. And when I looked at that, I knew exactly what had happened. His CPA had set him up with LLCs to own his Tennessee property and did a holding company. And he didn't understand that had he just used trusts in that scenario, he could have saved himself $30,000 a year. Well, by showing him that one mistake that was made, the client signed on right away because, over 10 years, that's $300,000 in savings. And it's just a matter of the entity you choose. Just by choosing mistake, making one mistake with your setup can have serious, tax consequences. And so that's what people don't necessarily always understand, or even their local professional doesn't understand it, because when you're investing out of state, they're not familiar with how property is titled out of state and what the tax consequences are for you and how you avoid reassessments and things of that nature.
Well, this is why I'm so glad we've been working with you for so many years. You've helped so many of our members at RealWealth and enriching me personally, and now our listeners today. So, Clint, thank you so much for joining me here on the RealWealth Show. And I know you offer a lot of education at RealWealth, so investors can go there to get more, because there is so much more, and you give lots and lots of education. We appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And, that's just what our calling is here, is to educate people to make sure that they're making informed decisions with their asset protection and tax planning.
Yeah. And even with all that education, it's still, don't do it on your own.
Yeah.
Even if you take a weekend workshop with Clint, that doesn't mean you know everything. Here I am still thinking I know so much after 20 years, and every time I talk to you, I learn more. So Again, thank you for being our guide.
Thanks.
And if you want to learn even more about how to protect yourself in real estate, we have a webinar coming up at RealWealth that Clint will be hosting. Just go to realwealthshow.com and click on the Connect tab. By the way, we have a brand new website, so let us know what you think about it. I'm Kathy Fedke. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Real Wealth Show. We'll see you next time.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as an offer to buy or sell any securities or to make or consider any investment or course of action. For more information, go to realwealthshow.com.